Is. And yeah, it's definitely nice to be visiting in Florida. Our family have spent more than the last 3 weeks traveling. We live in Wisconsin, but we had a board meeting for the mission in Ohio, and then we came down here to Florida, and we were in Orlando, and I hear this week, and tomorrow morning we're going to head back to Wisconsin. But the thought of the week, Romans 15, and starting in verse 18, Paul says, "For I will not dare to speak of any of those things which Christ hath not wrought by me, to make the Gentiles obedient by word and deed, through mighty signs and wonders by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and round about unto Illyricum I have fully preached the gospel of Christ. Yea, so have I strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation. But as it is written, to whom he was not spoken of, they shall see, and they that have not heard shall understand. He says, for which cause also I have been much hindered from coming to you, but now having no more place in these parts, and having a great desire these many years to come unto you, whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you, for I trust to see you in my journey, and to be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I be somewhat filled with your company. But now I go unto Jerusalem to minister unto the saints." And Paul, these Romans that Paul was writing to, he had not yet met, he had not yet been to Rome in person when he's writing this, but he's writing ahead. You see he has an intention of coming there, but you see all the various different places that he mentions there. And he says that from Jerusalem round about unto Illyricum, he said that he had fully preached the gospel of Christ. And that doesn't mean that, that he had preached to every specific person there, but he had preached throughout that region, established ministries, and, they could carry on the ministry in that area. But you see how his mindset is always to those areas where Christ hadn't been named, he said. And, when we think about the world today, we might think that in the day and age in which we live, that, and with all the communication that we have, and, outside of COVID, we have fairly easy travel. We might think that, maybe we could say that, like Paul said, he had fully preached from Jerusalem to Illyricum. We might like to think that we could say that things have been fully preached through the world, but that's not the case. And, some numbers I came across recently that just kind of put things in perspective. The world today is about 7.5 to 8 billion people. And when you think about unreached people groups in the world, now an unreached people group is, not so much a nation, because a lot of times national borders are just sort of drawn on a map, but, homogenous people groups. And unreached means that there is really no proclamation of the gospel there, or if there is, it's not big enough for them to carry on the work on their own. It might be some foreign missionary that is in some place. About a quarter of the world is still in unreached people groups. Where that doesn't mean that they're just lost people. It means that they're lost people who, if they wanted to find the gospel, there's nobody that they could go to learn the gospel. Of course, we understand, here in the United States there are many lost people, but there's gospel access everywhere, right? But a quarter of the world is in unreached people groups, and that's talking by Christianity of any type or denomination. 87% of the Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists in the world do not know a single Christian, right? So let's never think that the work is done. I mean, there's work to be done locally. There's work to be done, there are states in the United States where I don't know that there's a Grace Church in that entire state, but then worldwide, there's there's work to do, and people to be reached with the gospel who don't have any access even to the gospel today. And that should be a humbling thing to us, and yet for the American church, there is less of an emphasis on whether it be local evangelism and outreach or worldwide evangelism and outreach. There's less emphasis on it today probably than ever before, and yet there's work to be done, and that can be a sobering thought. Along those lines, I do want to say a couple things about the mission that I lead, and of course with the mission, our focus is on getting to those areas where Christ is not named. And the name of the mission is Grace Beyond Borders International. I was here a few years ago and talked to you about Grace Beyond Borders as well. There are a couple of things I want to pass around. One is a sign-up sheet if you would like to get emails, or you can put a physical mailing address there also, but we don't send a lot of things by physical mail. But if you would like to get updates from Grace Beyond Borders. And I'll also pass around some prayer cards for my family. I do have prayer cards for our various missionaries and things too, so if you want some of those, see me later. But I'll just start these around. And certainly there's no obligation to sign up for anything or take a prayer card, but we do appreciate that. And I will just say a couple things about the mission quickly. So Grace Beyond Borders, we have missionaries mostly in Southeast Asia. So we have missionaries in Thailand, Laos, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia. We also have a missionary in Nigeria, in West Africa. Most of our missionaries, none of our missionaries right now are Americans. A lot of times if you think about a missionary, you think about a Westerner who goes to other places in the world. Most of our missionaries are Filipinos who, and also some Indonesians and Nigerians, who are ministering in various places. I'm the executive director of the mission, so I'm not a missionary, but I do the administrative work on this side of things and visit churches and those kinds of things here, mostly in the U.S. I do try and go and visit different mission fields a couple of times a year. With COVID, that's been a lot harder, but in the last several years, I've had the opportunity to preach in Thailand and Indonesia and the Philippines, Nigeria. I'm planning on visiting Nigeria at the end of next month. So, and each of those mission fields are very different circumstances. Of course, the biggest thing affecting world missions right now is COVID, because travel is very difficult. We've had missionaries, Mario and Ella Indino, who are a married couple. Mario is Filipino, Ella is Indonesian. They were both in the Philippines just before everything with COVID, and Ella went back to Indonesia, and Mario was going to come like 2 weeks later, and in those 2 weeks, everything shut down. And so they spent a year and a half separated because you just couldn't get from one place to the other. And Mario just recently, about a couple of weeks ago, was able to get back to Indonesia finally, and be back with his wife. Although both of them are very active in ministry. They're always going different places. So when he got back to their hometown in Manado, Ella wasn't there because she had gone to be involved in some ministry in Palu, Indonesia. So Mario took I think a bus 30 hours to get to Palu, spent like 3 days with Ella, and then he went back to Manado, and she's somewhere else. But anyway, so they're in the same country anyway now. But we did have a couple of our missionaries earlier this year who passed away from COVID in the Philippines. Carlo and Elma Pagna, and they had been missionaries for many years. They had been involved in work with Things to Come Mission in Kenya, and Des is familiar with Kenya. They had pioneered a ministry in Uganda. These are Filipinos who went to Africa as missionaries, and then more recently they'd been working in the Philippines, in their home country. But they contracted COVID, and eventually both of them died because of COVID, and that was in some ways a sad thing, and yet they spent their lives serving the Lord, and they'll have more reward at the judgment seat of Christ than many Christians who live much longer lives, and we were thankful for how the Lord used even their sickness and death in a lot of positive ways. There were groups of grace believers. There are many grace churches in the Philippines, and groups of grace believers that are very divided and yet kind of came together to help the Panyas, and the online memorial service that we had for them. There were people involved in that service that normally would never probably set foot in the same church building together or whatever. They're grace believers, but they're divided for various reasons, and yet they were able to come together. So there were some very positive things that came out of that. As I said, and I'll wrap up, I am planning a trip to Nigeria. There are growing numbers of people there in Nigeria that are learning the grace message. There's only probably a couple of churches there that I would say are really grace churches, but then there's this wider group that are learning, rightly dividing, and in some cases are teaching some of those things in their churches. We will have a Bible conference in Jos, Nigeria, which is up. It's not the far north of the country, but it's kind of getting up into the north of the country. Jos, when you hear about violence in Nigeria between Muslims and Christians, Jos is kind of on the border of that. They don't have that so much in the city itself, but the outlying areas, it's not uncommon for there to be attacks of Muslims on Christians or Christians on Muslims. But we'll have a seminar there in Jos. We're putting together some things in Benin City, which is down in the south of the country. And we hope to have a Bible conference or a seminar as well in Lagos, which I have not been to before. That's the biggest city in the country. I forget what the population of Lagos is, something like 20 million people. And so I would just ask you to be in prayer for that. And if you have any questions about Grace Beyond Borders, we'll be here for, we'll be here for the fellowship and everything. And I'd love to talk to you about any of those places that I mentioned. All right.